And I've also heard that in some houses, people actually have gates guarding certain rooms in case someone breaks in. Is that true?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So where I live, I live in a what we call a security estate or a security complex. It's very difficult to get in, and a lot of people aren't able to do that. So it's common. It's standard for houses to have big walls around them with electric fences on top of the walls, and then some form of beams, an alarm system in the garden, the front lawn, so that if you walk in the garden, there's an alarm that is triggered that immediately connects to an armed response. And then on top of that, having these security gates at the front door and between rooms. So you often find you'll come to, especially in farms, like in every farm, you will see the security gates, for example, between the kitchen and the hallway that leads up to the sleeping areas where people sleep. And then they would put on the electric fence at night. They would put on the alarm that activates when someone somehow passes the electric fence that is on top of a wall. They would lock the front gate, and then they would lock the gates inside the house.
Wow.
It's
Guys, this is another really interesting one. Ans Roets here is actually explaining how the farm mothers in South Africa actually made him an activist, really giving some really graphic details on some of the events that actually happened on farms, and really opening up, the conditionalities that would probably demand South Africa to go a Zimbabwe kind of route of land grabs in South Africa, all right? He's actually in this video also really explaining, and I think he's not really happy that the president, he actually uses his words that the president is actually pretending that there are no farm mothers in South Africa. I think I also saw this in the video he made when he was launching his Lax Liberty movement, and to which I think that movement, I've actually asked for his email from some of you. If anyone has his email, if you guys can help me, I would really like to have a podcast with Ans Roets on this channel to really talk about some things, especially from an African perspective, because whatever it is that Dr. Ans Roets is trying to achieve in South Africa, I think from my own perspective as an outsider now, trying to really see a sustainable evolution of South Africa into a sustainable future. Anything that doesn't include the different races in South Africa, I think it will still be bound to fail. Whatever it is that Dr. Ans Roets would be trying to achieve with this Lax Liberty, I think there has to be a sort of a critical mass of blacks, coloreds, Indians in that movement. This is the only future I see for South Africa going forward. Whatever it is that anyone is trying to do, as long as you really want to maintain a sustainable South Africa, probably not in the wake of the Cape exit. Who wants the Western Cape to be out? That's another secessionist move. I studied secessionism during my PhD days, and the likes of the Biafra secessionists, the likes of the Casamance secessionists in Senegal, Senegal is now a more democratic country, which even former President Thabo Mbeki says South Africa needs to learn about democracy from Senegal. I've covered secessionism in Ambazonia in Cameroon. All right, it's called a language war, where a portion of Cameroon want to move away from the country because they speak mostly English, but then the majority speaks French. This is our colonial heritages. All right, but in South Africa, the Cape exit move would be a secessionism, and I really don't know if probably this would guarantee a safe, sustainable future for South Africa going forward. But if the likes of Dr. Ans Roets really wants to push a sustainable narrative with this new movement, Lax Liberty movement, if as I say, I'm speaking as an outsider now, if it doesn't have a collective, critical mass of blacks, whites, Indians, coloreds, tackling these issues continuously, no matter how tired we are, we should constantly talk about these issues. We have to constantly talk about these issues, regardless of how bitter and how difficult they are. These groups have to come together and be involved. If it's still a movement that still has mostly whites, South Africans, and all of that, or probably a certain narrative. I really don't know if probably that would lead to the vision which that movement actually seeks to achieve. So these are just my 1 or 2 cents. But in this video anyway, I think it's a really educational video, because all of this is just giving me an education, all right? And many Black South Africans are really wondering how it is that I'm so obsessed, or I feel obsessed with the Afrikaner case in this whole thing. For me, I'm just really I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the farmers, all right? If this was during the apartheid time, I think I would also be doing the same thing. If when the apartheid protagonists were assaulting the blacks, I would definitely be doing the same thing, highlighting the injustices which I see going forward. But now in this whole case with the Afrikaners, I'm trying to really put myself, because Ans Roets in this video there are some funny descriptions. I'm trying to imagine in my head. So he argues that there are some rooms, these farmers, all right, that they have some rooms on their farms which actually are guarded by gates. In Nigeria, for example, when I think about a gate, we usually think about gates, on a fence. And the gate, there's a fence and then there's a gate. So we open the gate, a car comes in and we close the gate. There's a small portion of the gate where somebody can walk in as well. But to take that concept and try to put in my head, to think about the gate as guarding a room in a house, bro, that's insane. So there are some of these things that he describes that I'm really trying to put myself in those shoes, and that's what makes me fascinated with how these guys have lived all these years in this same South Africa, that is in this same Africa where all of us actually are, and we really haven't yet heard these stories as much. So I'm really fascinated about this, and this is why I like to talk about and really bring these things to the fore, so that we can all understand how it is that this level of violence against this one group, probably, I know it's been fed by, a really bitter history, apartheid. I'm beginning to see some other videos of apartheid as well. I think there was a video I saw that really shocked me. I think there were some really crazy dogs that were released to attack some blacks. I don't know what those blacks did. Maybe they were, I don't know what it is they did anyway. But the viciousness with which these dogs were biting the guy, and the guy was screaming, and the white soldiers, I think under the apartheid, with the apartheid uniform and so police uniform and all of that, they just stood back watching this dog devour this black guy. There was a lot of violence, all right? Now it seems that we are seeing a return of that kind of violence and that anger. And for me, my job, the way I see my role as an outsider, I don't promise any solutions to all these things, but I think in trying to really understand, we might be able to get people to think about some of these issues and probably collectively think about a way we can move forward. But before we watch that, I just wanted us to watch this journalist break down the stats in terms of farm murders. He actually argues that he's actually breaking down Senzon Chunu's reports on the stats of farm murders in South Africa, which might negate what I've been hearing from many of you in your comments on Ans Roets, statistics in his book. His book is yet to arrive, but they give a certain number that might not correlate with the amount of farm murders which Ans Roets argues in this video. So let's quickly watch this journalist break down the stats from the SAPS, South Africa Police Services, on farm murders in South Africa in the attempt to really negate accusations of genocide of white Afrikaners in South Africa.
And a lot of reference has been made in these false or unsubstantiated claims of a white genocide, claims being made relating some of the conversation to farm murders in particular. What does the available data tell us?
The available data released by the Police Minister, Senzon Chunu, tabled the latest crime statistics for the period of October to December. The data shows that some serious crimes like murder and rape have decreased in all provinces. Murders were down by 9.8%, rape dropped by 3.3%, and attempted sexual offences decreased by 3.2%. But let's look specifically at farm-related murders, a subject often caught in the middle of politics and pain within this current contemporary political era that we are in. Farm murders in South Africa. Murders down by 9.8%, that is across the country, Tembegile. Rape down by 3.3%, that is across the country. Attempted sexual offenses, they are down by 3.2% within the country, Tembegile. But if we go to our next following slide, which looks at this particular contentious issue, which is often related and muddled up within this current political trajectory that we're in globally and geopolitically, farm-related murders across the country. Out of the 6,953 reported killings nationwide, 12 happened to be on farms. Out of the 6,953 reported killings nationwide, 12 happened to be on farms. Tembegile. Only one of those victims was a farmer.
So there's a clear pattern then emerging.
Out of the stats released by the Minister of Police and the Department and Fanima Samula, the Police Commissioner, 6,953 reported killings nationwide, 12 happened to be on farms. That is between October and December. Only one of those victims was a farmer. So there is no white genocide or Afrikaner genocide of farmers within the country. The remaining 11 included 5 farm dwellers. 5 farm dwellers. We know the race of those farm dwellers in the main, and who come from the previously disadvantaged and dispossessed of their heritage, which is land.
So these would be people, families who live on the holding?
This would be people, families who live on these particular farms. 5 of them were killed within that particular period. 4 farm employees. 4 farm employees. 1 security guard. And 1 whose role was not yet specified. That is the latest data released by the Minister of Police, Senzo Mchunu.
But as he argues, I don't know if this stat is true. You guys would have to engage in the comments so we can understand. But there's a lot of hate, in South Africa and all of this whole case. When I think about the situation of my own people, the Igbos in Nigeria, for example, they also still harbor a lot of hate. But many of them have been able to rise up and build businesses and build really crazy businesses. This is, for me, this is the dream I would like to see for Black South Africans, who are argued by many analysts. Paddy Lehutla, for example, argues that the blacks are the low of the low in terms of economic standing, in terms of education and all that. I would like to see a Black South Africa majority rise educationally. In fact, I saw an interesting stats today while I was studying, and the study was actually arguing, is actually, I think, an Afrobarometer study that actually argues and says that, that the level of democracy, the level of satisfaction of democracy in South Africa has actually declined from there was some hope anyway in 2018 when President Ramaphosa came to power, but the decline has been almost, the most extreme among all the countries in terms of democratic satisfaction in Africa, all right? And so these are kind of like the things. Another stat that was also really interesting for me was that, democratic satisfaction increases or decreases in relation to the level of education of the people, all right? So the more we see urban centers, for example, have a high level of dissatisfaction with democracy, while rural areas might just be, so there was that correlation, statistical correlation. So if we can see a much more educated Black youth in South Africa, we might maybe now slowly start seeing real concrete criticisms of the democratic evolution in South Africa, maybe more pressure on the government to really to demand accountability from the government and all that. But if we don't really see an educated populace, especially the majority Blacks now in South Africa, then I think that it might be a struggle. So this is actually why I bring out these videos, to hopefully get all of us to have a collective intelligence on how to move forward, all right? Despite the bitterness of our histories. I might not be South African, but I also come from a place of a bitter history. If you guys can go and read the Biafra Civil War, all right? So that history still it's kind of like still a burden to many Igbos today in South Africa going forward. But then they've really had to rise out and realize that the enemy is not the people you see, but there's something that really wants to continuously divide us, and we have to rise above that. So I think that's one of the things that Ans Roets is trying to really open up here in this video, which I thought was really interesting. And then we'll play Ans Roets' video trying to counter that and actually explain the ramifications of some of these farm mothers and how the farm mothers made him an activist in South Africa. And share your thoughts, guys, in the comments.
Now, one of the things we've heard on CNN, a former Obama-Harris staffer, she is a black woman, and she said that these white Afrikaners should just go back to Germany or Holland. Mm-hmm. And yeah. It's a bit ironic considering, I think it's a dangerous logical position she'd be taking, considering many white nationalists in the United States would tell her as a black woman to go back to Africa. What do you think about that argument that the Boers, just decolonize, go back home? Why can't they go to Germany or Holland?
Well, that just smacks of ethnic cleansing. This idea that the solution to this territory is to get rid of a certain section of society, just get out of here. And so the term genocide has been used a few times with regard to South Africa. I don't think that that's the appropriate term to describe what is happening. And we should be cautious of using a very particular legal terminology that could get you entangled in a legal debate about what is the application of the definition and so forth. But I do think that we should, without necessarily saying that what is happening in South Africa is ethnic cleansing, it certainly is a threat to ethnic cleansing. And what I mean, and the difference, of course, genocide is just killing people and just murdering them in large numbers. Ethnic cleansing is a bit broader. It's killing people, but it's also targeting them through legislation. It's saying things like go back to Europe, go back to Holland, or go back to the Netherlands, even though we've been here for centuries. We've been in Africa since before the Enlightenment. And now suddenly the solution is just to cleanse the country of our existence or of our presence. It's a really, really dangerous thing to say. And now if you consider things like calling on people to leave, pushing them out through racial discriminatory laws, murdering them, chanting songs about murdering them, publicly saying that they should have fewer rights, it becomes increasingly difficult to see how this is not ethnic cleansing. And it should be called out, and we should take a stance against this. And our friends abroad in America and in Europe and in other countries should be much more outspoken against what is currently happening in South Africa.
There was a similar phenomenon in other African nations, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where white farmers were chased out of the country, and it resulted in, let's just say, a short supply of food, and then a celebration upon their return. Do you think is there a concern for South Africa that if these farmers keep getting killed and attacked this way, food production could be at risk?
Oh, absolutely. So I grew up in the north of South Africa, in what is now called the Limpopo province, in an agricultural community, very close to Zimbabwe. And as a child, that's the reason actually why I'm speaking with you right now. I became an activist because I grew up seeing the farm attacks happening around me as a child, and seeing on the news what's happening just a few hundred kilometers away across the border in Zimbabwe. And just on my wall here, I have a framed $100 trillion note. It's a Zimbabwean dollar from, I think, 2003. And I believe it still is the world record of highest inflation ever. Just how that country, and it's really a tragedy what happened in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was called before then, just how that country was completely destroyed by land reform, by the Zimbabwean government in a very aggressive way, targeting the property belonging to commercial farmers for racial reasons, chasing them out of the countries, doing the things that politicians in South Africa are threatening with at the moment. And yes, we really do have some of the best farmers in the world. The commercial farmers in South Africa are extremely productive, are very good at farming. We export food. We're a significant foundation to the economy, even though the economy is very large and agriculture is a small part of the economy. A significant section of the South African economy is dependent on agriculture or linked to agriculture. And it's very sad and tragic and dangerous to see just the extent to which these commercial farmers are being targeted, are being villainized. Politicians chanting about murdering them. When they are murdered, the president pretends that it's not happening, and so forth. So yes, we are concerned about that. I do think we're a bit better equipped than the people of Zimbabwe were, in the sense that we have a much more well-organized civil society in South Africa, which they didn't have in Zimbabwe. And so I think we have well-organized communities who are armed, who are driving patrols in their own communities, who can defend themselves. And I think I'm not so convinced that a Zimbabwe type scenario would play out in South Africa, although that's possible. I am concerned that we will just have continued deterioration over time, up to the point where South Africa becomes a next Zimbabwe, but without having had the very significant crash that Zimbabwe had in the early 2000s.
I've heard that many people have big fences around their properties. They hire private security on call for the crime. And I've also heard that in some houses, people actually have gates guarding certain rooms in case someone breaks in. Is that true?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So where I live in a what we call a security estate or a security complex. It's very difficult to get in, and a lot of people aren't able to do that. So it's common, it's standard for houses to have big walls around them with electric fences on top of the walls, and then some form of beams, an alarm system in the garden, the front lawn, so that if you walk in the garden, there's an alarm that is triggered that immediately connects to an armed response. And then on top of that, having these security gates at the front door and between rooms. So you often find you'll come to, especially in farms, like in every farm, you will see the security gates, for example, between the kitchen and the hallway that leads up to the sleeping areas where people sleep. And then they would put on the electric fence at night. They would put on the alarm that activates when someone somehow passes the electric fence that is on top of a wall. They would lock the front gate, and then they would lock the gates inside the house.
Wow.
It's a very common thing to see in South Africa.
You know, I had met a couple that was from South Africa about 7 years ago, and they were in South Korea, and they told me crime. What they said was crime's really not that bad. People think it's really, really bad, but I've only been carjacked, I think, 5 times. And, as someone who grew up in Chicago on the South Side where crime is pretty bad, I was like, I've never been carjacked, and I'm from like a really bad neighborhood. I wonder if, the South Africans have just largely adapted to the expectation of crime. It seems normal.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It has to a large extent become normalized. It's very, very difficult to find someone in South Africa that wasn't the victim of some form of violent crime, like being mugged, being carjacked, or something like that. I personally, with my kids, 2 years ago, my entire family was in an armed robbery in a restaurant. It was my son's birthday. We went out to have ice cream, and as we got up to pay, there was armed robbers starting to shoot people in the restaurant. Whoa. And we had to dive below the tables, next to a dead body. There are people who have had much worse experiences, and there are people who have not had that bad experience in South Africa. But it has become normalized. We do have, you could say, islands of safety, like the security estates. There are certain neighborhoods that are quite safe, very comparable to European cities. I live in Pretoria, the capital city. I mean, I drive around every day, but you do know that there are certain areas that you have to avoid. There are certain streets that you have to avoid, and you don't want to be driving around at night, especially in some areas where you would be almost guaranteed to be a victim of crime. But broadly speaking, it's certainly a problem.